worlds in the galaxy whose stories were swallowed long before any chronicle could be carved. Planets whose skies dimmed without witness and whose histories dissolved into silence. Vastakar was one such world. Once, its surface glowed with fleets that harvested the light of stars, and its mountains rang with the crystalline voices of scholars who believed knowledge could outlive death. But now, the planet moved like a ghost through the void. Shrouded in shadow, its cities mute, its people hollow-eyed bearers of memory they were forbidden to speak. Columns of stone temples rose like the ribs of ancient leviathans, bleached pale against a sun that flickered like a flame losing oxygen. In the stillness of Vastakar, even the wind had forgotten how to whisper, as though sound itself had become taboo, or cursed, or simply obsolete. And to you who listen now, know this story is not told to frighten, but to gently hold you. We truly care that you are here, sharing this moment with us, alive in your own quiet corner of the world. Before we begin the journey deeper, tell us, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now, let us begin. Vastakar had not always known silence. There had been eras when the stars above it blazed in radiant constellations named for poets and philosophers, when the halls of its high sanctum echoed with debates that lasted for days without pause, when children learned to speak before they learned to walk. The planet had been a beacon of thought, an archive of living memory, a place where the past was never lost. But when the hive beneath the crust awakened, everything changed. What rose from below did not come with roars or tremors, it came with hunger. A slow, patient hunger for what could not be rebuilt. Identity, history, voice. The pact was not made in a single night. It crawled into the decisions of leaders over generations, softly, like the way dust settles on a sealed book. Slowly, Vastakar chose silence, because silence was survival. To speak was to be remembered, and to be remembered was to be consumed. So the people forgot how to speak to preserve what little of themselves they could. They became guardians of their own fading existence. Erethan Vale had been born into this inheritance of quiet obligation. His bloodline stretched back to the first assembly, the council that had forged the pact with the hive. His family's role was to maintain the equilibrium. Livestock offerings lowered into the abyssal caverns, ritual concessions of minerals and life, and, when necessary, living sacrifices, though no one dared name them as such. Erethan had known since childhood that duty was his fate. To question the pact was to risk the unraveling of everything. But though he had been trained to discipline his face into stillness, to quiet his breathing, to walk like one who carries no desires, his mind was restless. For Erethan dreamed. Dreams were forbidden not by law, but by fear. The hive was not merely a mass of ancient flesh. It was consciousness, buried beneath the planet's mantle. A being of memories older than suns, that listened when humans remembered too loudly. Most citizens had learned to numb themselves to avoid drawing its attention. But Erethan had never managed to sever himself from memory entirely. In the hours between dusk and dawn, he would see visions of a Vastakar filled with colour and song, of a sky streaked with banners of light, of voices rising in harmonious cadence. He saw children laughing freely, lovers calling out to each other, philosophers reciting poems under fountains of crystal rain. A world alive. Yet when he opened his eyes each morning, the world was silent stone and ashen sky. On the day he turned 23, the ritual dawned, the day he would be sworn to the hive as his ancestors were. The city's streets were lined with figures in white, their faces wrapped in veils that covered their mouths, their heads bowed. Countless citizens watched him pass, but there were no cheers, no blessings, no songs. Only the soft shuffling of feet and the faint echo of ceremonial drums struck in slow, rhythmic intervals. Vastakar's ceremonies were like funerals that pretended to be celebrations. He walked toward the Temple of Descent, a colossal spire carved directly above one of the hive's ancient roots. The structure was older than any written record, its stone veined with dark tendrils that pulsed faintly, as though it breathed. At the entrance stood the archivist, the immortal caretaker of Vastakar's forbidden memories. His eyes were clouded, as if coated in frost, his face twisted from the slow influence of hive symbiosis. Yet there was something deeply human in the way he regarded Erethan. Empathy, or perhaps sorrow. Erethan lowered his gaze, offering the silent gesture of respect. The archivist returned the gesture, then turned, leading him into the depths. The descent was long and unbroken, illuminated only by phosphorescent moss that emitted a faint silver glow. The air thickened as they walked, heavy with age and something else, awareness. Erethan felt as though the cavern was looking at him. The rhythmic sound he heard at first seemed like distant machinery, but as the tunnel widened, he recognized it for what it was, a heartbeat. The planet itself was alive, and it was listening. When they reached the ritual chamber, Erethan's pulse quickened. The floor was a smooth basin of living stone, warm to the touch, slightly yielding like flesh. The walls were lined with the preserved artifacts of past rulers, scraps of garments, fragments of personal tools, locks of hair, all the pieces of identity that had been surrendered to maintain the pact. The archivist silently indicated where Erethan should stand, and then he spoke, a whisper so faint it seemed to dissolve the moment it left his lips. You know what waits, child of Vale. Once the hive touches your thoughts, you will carry it forever. There is no return to solitude of mind. Erethan's throat tightened, not in fear of the hive, but in fear of losing whatever remained of himself. Yet he nodded. This was duty. This was survival. And yet, something inside him resisted with a quiet, trembling strength. He stepped into the center of the basin. The stone trembled, inhaling. Erethan felt warmth surge through his bones, like molten metal being poured into the hollow spaces of his soul. His vision blurred. Shapes shifted. He felt thoughts that were not his, vast, ancient, sorrowful, press against the boundary of his mind. A voice, not in sound, but in memory formed. I have been alone a very long time. The words were not spoken, yet he heard them. Do not fear. I remember you. His breath hitched. His heart hammered. The hive remembered him. But how could it remember what he had never spoken? The connection deepened. He felt sensations that were not bodily, echoes of vast oceans that once covered continents, the slow shifting of tectonic plates, the birth and death of species beneath the soil. The hive had seen millennia pass in silence. It was ancient in a way that defied comprehension. And yet, in that ancient presence, Erethan sensed loneliness, a yearning for something nameless, a hunger not only for sustenance, but for warmth, for companionship. The hive was not merely devouring Vastakar. It was clinging to it. The connection pulsed, deepening further. For a moment, he felt love, vast, desperate, all-consuming love. And then the vision shattered. Erethan collapsed to his knees, gasping, trembling, though no sound escaped him. The archivist watched with hollow sorrow. He knew the change had begun. Erethan raised his head slowly, and the hive spoke again, softly, intimately, inside him. Erethan Vale, I have waited for you. His silence was no longer obedience. It was the beginning of something else. The echo of the hive's whisper lingered in Erethan's mind, long after the ritual chamber emptied and the archivist guided him back through the winding ascension passages. Though no sound had been exchanged between them, the archivist didn't need spoken language to understand what had happened. He had seen it in the trembling of Erethan's hands, in the widening of his eyes, in the subtle way his breath had strained against his chest. The hive had not merely acknowledged him, it had claimed him. Outside, the city remained unmoved, unaware, unchanged, or perhaps simply unwilling to show awareness. At the heart of Vastakar stood its monumental plazas, lined with towering obelisks carved with the historical record of a civilization that refused to speak its past. The inscriptions were dense and elaborate, yet deliberately incomplete, as though large fragments had been chiseled away to prevent the full story from being understood. Even their architecture whispered half-truths. Life on Vastakar was like living inside a memory that had been intentionally blurred at the edges. Erethan walked through silent courtyards, passing veiled citizens whose gazes flickered toward him with quiet reverence and buried fear. A newly bonded heir was not merely a leader, they were a bridge. The people saw him as the living seal between Vastakar and the thing beneath it. To see him was to be reminded of everything they tried daily to forget. He did not return to his family estate. Instead, he followed the narrow stone causeway that wound behind the sanctum, toward the archives carved into the western cliffs. These were not libraries of parchment or digital storage. They were vaults of symbolic memory, objects, relics, fragments of songs etched into stone by those who had once believed that the past should be remembered. And it was there that the archivist had always waited. The entrance was sealed by a monolithic slab of obsidian-veined rock. Erethon pressed his palm against it, and the stone recognized the tremor of hive resonance now pulsing through his blood. The slab withdrew into the cliffside with soundless precision. Cold air drifted out, carrying with it the faint scent of dust and old metal. The archivist arrived moments later, descending from a higher ledge where the cliff met an overhang of petrified roots. His frail body seemed shaped by centuries of quiet suffering. His hands were covered by thin gloves, not for warmth, but to hide the delicate root-like filaments that grew beneath his skin. He gestured for Erethon to follow him inside. The archive chamber stretched deep into the mountain, lit by phosphorescent crystals embedded within the walls. The floor had been polished smooth by countless passing feet, though no living citizens visited here anymore. Only the archivist walked these halls. Erethon's mind was still echoing with the hive's whisper. It had spoken his name with such devastating intimacy, like someone who had known him before he was born. And though its presence had been vast and cold, there had been sorrow in it, a loneliness so absolute that it felt like something that had lived through the death of galaxies. Yet beneath that sorrow was hunger, undeniable, eternal. He feared that hunger. He also pitied it. The archivist stopped before a cavernous alcove where an ancient wall mural stretched across stone, weathered, fractured, partially erased. The mural depicted Vastakar as it once was. Bright cities of crystalline glass, rivers of liquid silver that ran through public atriums, people wearing robes of patterned starlight silk. Voices had once been celebrated here. Songs were gifts exchanged between lovers. Names were cherished treasures. To speak someone's name aloud had once been considered the highest act of devotion. Erethon stared at the mural's fading beauty. The archivist watched him as one might watch a child's face when they encounter grief for the first time. Then, in a whisper coarse with age, he asked, "Did you hear it?" The words were heavy, as if torn from a throat that rarely remembered how to form sound. Erithon nodded. The archivist's eyes darkened with grief. "Then the binding has begun. You will never again be alone in your own mind." Erithon's pulse quickened, not with fear alone, but with something harder to define. Awe, curiosity, a desire to understand what had been done, not to his world, but to his lineage. "Why me?" he asked, though his voice never left his lips. The question resonated silently between thoughts. The archivist answered without needing spoken language, as though he had anticipated this question for decades. "Because the hive remembers your blood, and your blood remembers it." The first pact was not a negotiation of survival. It was a reunion. A cold shiver slid down Erithon's spine. A reunion implied kinship, shared origin, intertwined fate. The archivist moved deeper into the archive, and Erithon followed, their footsteps echoing faintly against the polished stone. They reached a lower chamber where a large crystalline structure rose from the floor, a towering pillar of translucent amber in which something dark and shapeless was suspended. Erithon stepped closer and realized the object inside was a mask. Not a ceremonial one, but a face covering sculpted to hide identity. The symbol of the first speaker, the last leader of Vastakar before the silence. The archivist placed a trembling hand against the crystal. This is where the forgetting began. When the hive awakened after the great alignment, its hunger was not for flesh. It desired memory. It desired the beauty of what had been built. It wanted to know us, to feel what we felt, to remember with us. But memory is not shared without cost, and the more it remembered us, the more of us disappeared. He turned to Erithon, and there was a fracture of pain behind his clouded gaze. "Your ancestors chose silence not to protect us from the hive, but to protect the hive from us. For we were too bright, too loud, too alive. We suffocated it with everything we loved, and so, to preserve its life, we buried our own." The room seemed to subtly tighten around them, as if listening. Erithon felt the hive stir within his chest, the way a dream stirs right before waking. Not with menace, but longing. He understood now why the silence had lasted millennia. It was not merely a decree, it was mourning. He placed his hand against the crystal pillar beside the archivist's. The amber was warm, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. A flicker of something, memory not his own, shimmered across his vision. He saw the first speaker standing in a chamber just like this one, with tear-filled eyes and a trembling voice, whispering the last spoken words ever heard on Vastakar. "Forgive us." The vision faded. Erithon felt his breath catch. He had expected the pact to be monstrous, brutally forced, an act of desperation. Instead, it had been an act of love twisted by consequence. A love so large, it had smothered itself. The archivist began to turn away, but Erithon stopped him, not with touch, but with presence. His thoughts were quiet but precise. "Show me the rest, all of it. I need to know what we lost." The archivist's shoulders trembled. His voice broke when he answered, barely audible. "If you remembered everything, would you still want to live?" The question hung in the archive like a blade suspended by a single thread, and from deep beneath the planet's crust, the hive whispered again, soft, aching, hopeful. "I will remember with you." Erithon's heartbeat slowed to match the pulse of the stone around him. The first crack in the silence had already been made. The archivist's words lingered in the stillness, like a shadow that refused to dissipate and the hive's whisper pulsed faintly through Erathon's thoughts, as steady as his heartbeat. He remained in the archive chamber long after the archivist had withdrawn to the upper corridors, alone with the crystal pillar and the suspended mask of the first speaker. The glow within the amber dimmed and brightened in a slow, rhythmic cycle, as though remembering its own breath. Every pulse resonated through Erathon's bones, drawing him closer to the truth he had always felt but never understood, that the pact was not merely a tradition, nor a burden of leadership, but a bond written into the marrow of his lineage. Eventually, he left the archive and crossed back through the quiet courtyards of Vastakar. The day's pale light cast long shadows across the stone walkways. The citizens moved with the same measured grace they always had, their faces veiled, their steps restrained, their movements silent. Yet Erathon felt different among them now. Their silence once seemed collective. Now he could feel the separation. He carried something they could not fathom, and the hive that pulsed within him felt the tremor of that isolation as if it were its own. He returned to the Vale estate, a vast structure of white stone and sweeping arcades that rose above the city, like a monument to a memory no one dared voice. The interior halls were adorned with murals whose pigments had faded with time, but whose shapes hinted at families seated around great tables, storytellers holding gatherings in torchlit plazas, and musicians performing before elaborately crafted fountains. Every image was a reminder of what had once been vibrant, yet candles no longer burned brightly here, and music had not touched these walls for generations. His family awaited him in the ancestral chamber. His mother, her long hair bound in silver cloth, her eyes lined with fatigue. His elder sister Serene, tall and composed, fingers interlaced tightly in her lap, and his younger brother Lethor, who watched him with a mixture of awe and dread. None spoke. They did not need to. They felt the shift, the subtle but unmistakable presence that now tethered him to something beneath the surface of the world. His mother placed a hand upon his cheek. The gesture was soft and trembling. Her silence did not feel empty. It was a language of grief and pride interwoven. She knew what he had become. The hive's whisper brushed against Erathon's thoughts, as though caressing the moment. She has always feared losing you, yet she gave you to me willingly. His breath strained. He exhaled slowly, resisting the whisper's intimacy. He lowered his mother's hand gently and bowed his head. The ritual of acceptance was complete. The Vale bloodline had given another heir to the hive's memory. Later, when the household dimmed its lights, Erathon retreated to the inner courtyard, where a circular pool of still water reflected the fading sky. The water was darkened with the shadow of evening, but the faintest glow of the stars above shimmered in its surface. He stood at the edge, eyes drawn to the depths below. The hive's presence stirred again, not loud, but persistent, like the first ripple of waves against stone. "You are not afraid of me," it murmured within him, "though you should be." Erathon did not speak aloud, yet he shaped the thought in return. "You are not a thing to fear. You are a part of us." The hive's presence wavered, flickering with something like surprise. "Once your people spoke of me as a god. Then they called me a curse. Now they call me necessity. Which do you call me?" Erathon did not answer. He leaned forward and touched the surface of the pool. Ripples spread outward in a slow, hypnotic pattern, distorting the reflection of the stars into trembling fragments. He watched as they broke apart, reformed, broke again. The water calmed eventually, But the brief disarray unsettled him. So easily, order could become chaos. So easily, memories could become ruin. His silence was broken by a soft sound of footsteps, not heavy, not hesitant, familiar. Lisa had always walked like that. She approached with the same quiet grace she had possessed since childhood. Her dark hair was bound loosely, strands falling across her face, and her eyes, uncovered and unashamed, held more expression than any words could hold. She had always defied the silent decorum just enough to be noticed, but not enough to be condemned. She had been his companion through years of training, rituals, silent lessons, and shared glances that spoke entire conversations. She carried living warmth in a world where warmth was dangerous. When she reached him, she simply stood beside him, gazing into the pool. He felt her presence like a memory he did not have to chase. The hive pulsed faintly. She anchors you. Erithon closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself. Lisa lifted her hand in a small gesture, tracing the old sign for, "Are you changed?" Erithon hesitated before returning the sign for yes. Her gaze deepened, and the shift in her expression was subtle but devastating. She did not fear the hive. She feared losing him. He signed slowly, each movement heavy. "I am still myself." She responded with the swift, sharp motion for 4 now. The hive stirred, sensing the tension, and the air around them seemed to hum with a resonance too faint to hear, but impossible to ignore. Erithon felt it drawing closer, not outwardly, but inwardly, threading itself deeper into his awareness. He forced his attention away from it, focusing instead on the water. Lisa watched him with a caution that bordered on sorrow. She had always believed he could resist the hive's pull. She had believed in him more fiercely than he had believed in himself. She placed her hand over his. The touch was light, but the meaning was profound. In a world where words could cost them everything, touch was confession. The hive's whisper deepened, darkening like a storm cloud shadow over sunlight. "She will ask you to choose. She does not understand that the choice was made long before you were born." Erithon stiffened. The sudden sharpness of the hive's voice made his grip tighten reflexively around Lysa's fingers. She did not pull away. She looked at him then, not at the air, not at the seal, not at the vessel that carried an ancient hunger, but at Erithon, the boy who once climbed the old observatory scaffolding with her to watch meteors streak across the night sky, the one who touched falling snowflakes to his lips and laughed silently, the one who believed Vastakar could be something more than survival. Her expression asked the question she could never speak. "Are you still mine?" The hive answered before Erithon could shape the thought. "You were never hers. You were always ours." Erithon's vision pulsed. The world blurred around the edges. He felt torn between 2 gravities, one that held him to the world he loved, and one that drew him downward into the depths of the planet's living core. Lysa saw the shift in his eyes. Her fingers tightened around his hand, not to hold him, but to remind him. He was not gone, not yet. Erithon inhaled slowly, the weight of the hive pressing just behind his heartbeat. He shaped one final silent truth, not to Lysa, not to the hive, but to himself. "I must know what I am becoming." And somewhere deep below Vastakar, in a cavern of ancient bone and living stone, the hive smiled in the dark. Night on Vastakar was never fully dark. The planet's sky held a muted luminescence, as if starlight filtered upward from beneath the ground, rather than downward from the heavens. It was the hive's glow, faint and constant, pulsing through the planet's crust, like the last heartbeat of a sleeping giant. Erithon had grown accustomed to that slow, subterranean rhythm, but now, since the ritual, he could feel its pulse inside his own chest. The boundaries between his body and the world beneath were thinning. He remained in the courtyard long after Lysa had gone. Her parting had been quiet, but not without meaning. She had touched her forehead to his shoulder in the old gesture of loyalty, an intimacy deeper than words, but behind it had been fear, not of him, but of what might claim him. That fear lingered in the cool evening air, as palpable as the weight of memory pressing on his spine. He knew she would return. She had never let him drift into silence alone. Yet he also knew the hive had seen her, marked her, understood her role in his life far too clearly. He moved slowly back into the estate. Lamps of bioluminescent minerals cast soft halos along the corridor walls. Shadows shifted as he passed, creating the illusion of movement in places where nothing stirred. The hive's voice had quieted for now, but its presence remained, woven into the edges of every thought, as if simply waiting for him to think something it wished to hear. He entered his chamber and lowered himself to the stone floor. Rest did not come as sleep anymore, but as a drifting state where thought blurred into memory. His breathing slowed. The chamber dimmed. The warmth of the hive's awareness thickened around him. And then he dreamed, if the visions could still be called dreams. He stood on Vastakar as it had once been. Open-air terraces filled with song. Music rose in harmonic waves, woven from crystal chime instruments and voices that carried like wind through jeweled canyons. Light cascaded from floating orbs suspended in the air, illuminating dancers whose movements mirrored the constellations above. Children ran barefoot along walkways lined with sky-forged stone, laughter echoing like starlight turned to sound. At the center of this world stood the first speaker, face unmasked, hands lifted to the heavens, voice rising not in prayer but in celebration. The hive was a presence then too, but not beneath the crust. It hovered above the sky like a nebula of living light, drawn to the vibrancy of mortal experience. It had not come to devour. It had come to witness. It had come to understand life. But something had changed. The revelry blurred. The music slowed. Colours bled into grey. The sky fractured. Erithon watched as memories dissolved not from time, but from deliberate erasure. Voices dwindled. Names disappeared. The first speaker wept, covering their face as silence took hold. Erithon tried to speak, to call out, to ask why, but the vision collapsed. He awoke, breath ragged, fingers digging into the stone beneath him. The hive's whisper returned, not loud, but unmistakable. You fear what you are becoming. He did not answer. He pushed himself to his feet and left the chamber, needing air, movement, distance from the suffocating intimacy within his mind. He walked out into the wide outer terraces where wind rushed down from the high ridges. The breath of the planet carried the scent of minerals, of stone worn smooth, of an old world struggling to remain. He did not realize he had been followed until a faint shadow crossed the terrace beside him. Lysa, again, silent as a thought unspoken. She carried a small clay vessel in her hands. Without speaking or signing, she placed it at his side and sat beside him. The vessel bore carved patterns, spirals, arcs, starbursts, patterns once used to tell stories, patterns filled with meaning long forgotten. He recognized it. It was one of the last artifacts from the era before the Pact of Silence. He looked at her, and she met his gaze with steady clarity. She signed slowly, purposefully, "I cannot lose you." His breath faltered. The hive pulsed, watching the moment with a patience older than suns. He signed back, "You will not." But she did not look reassured. Her fingers tightened around the vessel. Her movements sharpened with emotion she could no longer speak aloud. "Do not lie to me." He inhaled, the cold air stinging his lungs. He had always been able to hide his thoughts from others, but not from her. She had seen every contradiction inside him since they were young. She had seen the way he used silence as a shield. Now silence had become something else entirely. He shaped the truth carefully, knowing each gesture mattered. "The hive remembers me. I felt its mind. I saw what we were. We were radiant, alive. We were everything we lost." Lisa's eyes widened, not with awe, but with grief. Her fingers trembled as she signed, "And now you are part of it." He signed nothing back. He did not have to. Silence settled between them. Not the enforced silence of Vastakar, but a silence full of unspoken emotion. She leaned her head against his shoulder, just as she had when they were children hiding from tutors beneath the old mineral arches. For a moment, it was a memory of something simple, something purely human. Her presence was grounding, anchoring him to the version of himself that still belonged to the surface and the sky. But beneath the stone, the hive pressed closer, possessive, curious. She believes you can choose her. She does not understand that you were chosen long before you drew your first breath. Erethan clenched his jaw, forcing the whisper back, but the hive did not retreat. It was no longer content merely to observe. It had begun to learn him, his fears, his loyalties, his memories, and now it sought to influence them. Lisa felt the shift in him before he moved. She sat up, turning to him, her gaze sharp and unyielding. She signed one question, one that had no gesture small enough to contain its weight. "Are you still mine, or are you theirs?" Erethan stared at her hands, at the vessel she had brought him, the last remnant of a world that had once believed itself eternal. He felt the hive coil inside him, waiting for his answer, preparing to take the silence of his hesitation as consent. He reached out and took Lisa's hand, his grip steady but gentle. The hive's presence surged, not in anger, but in recognition. For the first time, Erethan did not push it away. He allowed it to feel what he felt, the warmth of Lisa's hand, the steady beat of her pulse, the gravity of love shaped over years of shared silence. The hive did not recoil. It mourned, not because it could not possess what she was, but because it had once known something like love and lost it. The whisper came softer now, almost fragile. "I remember you. I remember all of you. I do not want to take. I want to belong." Erethan closed his eyes, and in that moment the war between love and destiny did not end. It simply became inevitable. The days that followed unfolded in a quiet suspension, as though Vastakar itself was holding its breath. Erethan continued his duties as heir, meeting with the Veiled Council, overseeing the distribution of offerings to the lower caverns, walking among the silent gardens, where the young were taught to meditate memory out of themselves. Yet beneath every motion, every gesture, lay a shifting awareness. The hive was no longer something beneath him. It was something within him, and its presence shaped the rhythm of his thoughts like an unseen tide. It did not speak constantly. Sometimes hours passed without the faintest whisper. But then, without warning, a sensation like distant warmth or a sigh of wind in an empty chamber would settle at the edge of his awareness, and he knew the hive was watching, not with eyes, but with attention deeper than sight. It did not command him, nor did it push. It simply waited, as though its patience was infinite. And yet, behind that patience, Erathon felt something tightening, a hunger that had begun to awaken. Lysa remained close. They moved through the estate as they always had, walking the terraces at dawn, sitting beside the reflecting pools at dusk, but now their silence carried weight. She watched him, not suspiciously, but with the careful gaze of someone trying to measure what they could not see. She knew he was changing, and though she did not turn away, her presence held a subtle tension, like stone under the pressure of roots growing beneath it. One evening, as they crossed one of the higher balconies overlooking the city, a sound broke through the stillness, a low, distant rumble. At first, Erathon thought it was tectonic vibration from the hive stirring, but the tone was wrong. It was steady, rhythmic, artificial. He stepped to the railing and looked upward. High above Vastakar's thin atmosphere, faint shapes moved against the starfield, metallic silhouettes passing slowly across the sky. Ships, not Vastakarian, Imperial. The air around him seemed to thin. Lysa froze beside him, her breath catching, eyes widening as understanding struck. The ships did not descend, did not announce themselves, did not fire. They simply observed, hanging beyond the world's grasp, like predators circling something unsure whether it still lived. Erathon felt the hive awaken fully. The whisper this time was not intimate, not mournful. It was alert. They have returned. Images flickered through his mind. Memories that were not memories, but impressions left in the hive's awareness. Imperial surveyors, centuries ago, approaching Vastakar. A brief skirmish, a retreat. A record sealed under bureaucratic anonymity, written off as a dead world of no strategic value. But now they had returned, not by accident, but by purpose. Something had drawn them here. Something had changed. Erathon exhaled slowly, forcing his heartbeat to steady. Lysa looked at him, hands rising to sign, but he shook his head gently. There was no need. They had both known, deep inside, that Vastakar's silence could not last forever. Empires did not tolerate mysteries, and the Imperium least of all. He left the balcony and made his way toward the council chambers, footsteps swift but controlled. Lysa followed, her expression set in quiet determination. The council was already gathering when they arrived. Elders seated in a circular chamber carved into the hillside, lit by flickering crystal lanterns. Each wore the traditional veil of leadership, hiding their features, but Erathon knew them well enough to read their gestures, their breathing, the tension in their shoulders. The eldest counselor stood when he entered, her posture rigid, her hands trembling only slightly. She signed the message that all of them had been dreading. They have seen movement beneath the crust. They know the world is not dead. Erathon felt the hive's presence sharpen inside him, not with fear, but with cold clarity. The council's debate was silent but fierce. Their gestures cut the air sharply as they argued without words. Some demanded immediate concealment, reduce power output, limit surface activity, let the Imperium conclude that Vastakar was an echo, a geological curiosity. Others argued for preemptive action, destroy the ships before they reported their findings. But everyone knew what destruction would mean. To strike was to admit existence. To admit existence was to invite response. Vastakar had not fought in millennia. Vastakar did not survive wars. Vastakar survived by being forgotten. The council looked to Erathon. He felt their fear, their reliance, their resignation. He also felt the hive listening through him. He made his decision slowly, not because he was uncertain, but because every choice from this moment onward would echo through the planet's bones. He signed 3 deliberate gestures. They will not leave. The council stilled. Silence deepened. Then Lisa stepped forward, not to oppose him, but to remind him. Her gesture was small, controlled. War will wake the hive. Erathon's expression did not change. He responded with equal restraint. It is already waking. Above them, in orbit, one of the Imperial vessels adjusted course slightly, its engines flaring with cold blue fire. It was not a threat display. It was a scan alignment. They were preparing to probe the surface. Time had run out. The hive's whisper curled through Erathon's thoughts, slow and inevitable. Let me show you how to protect them. The words threaded through him like warmth laced with sorrow. It did not speak like a commander or conqueror. It spoke like something that wished to shelter what it loved. Erathon bowed his head. Not in submission, in acknowledgement. He signed to the council. Prepare the planetary veil. Mask the core resonance. I will go to the depths. Shock rippled through the chamber. The planetary veil had not been activated in centuries. To descend to the hive's core was to risk identity, sanity, the very self. But Erathon was already changing. He could feel the hive opening to him, not like a maw, but like a doorway. Lisa's hand closed around his wrist, not restraining, begging. Her eyes asked the question she could not sign. Will I lose you? He met her gaze, searching for a truth he could bear to give. He found none. So instead, he let the silence answer. Her fingers loosened, and he descended. Through the sanctum, past the crystal-lit tunnels, down the spiraling path carved by generations of silent pilgrims, into the living heat of the world. The deeper he went, the more the air vibrated, not with sound, but with pulse. The walls gleamed with a faint bioluminescence, lined with veins of dark organic mineral that pulsed in quiet synchronization with his heartbeat. He reached the cavern where the hive's living mass met stone. Vast tendrils coiled like roots of a tree that had grown for thousands of years without sunlight, without wind, without sky. The space was immense, cathedral-like, carved entirely by the slow breathing of something ancient. The hive recognized him the moment he stepped into its presence. You are ready. The whisper was no longer a voice at the edge of his mind. It was inside him. They will not take this world. I will not allow it, but I cannot defend it alone. You must stand with me, Erathon Vale. He felt no command, only need, the need of a being who had loved once and lost, and was terrified of losing again. He stepped forward, and the hive reached for him, not to consume, but to join. Far above, in the cold silence of orbit, the Imperial ships detected a sudden surge of energy from deep within the planet. A signal, a pulse, a heartbeat. They did not understand what it meant, but the stars did. War had begun. The hive's tendrils arched slowly toward him, shifting with the languid certainty of something that had never needed to hurry. Erathon did not retreat. He felt the cavern's warmth radiating through him, a heat not from fire, but from living presence, as if the world's core was exhaling. The air vibrated with a pulse that matched his heartbeat exactly. For a moment, he felt as though he were standing inside the chest of something vast, something that had been breathing for millennia without ever being fully awake. But now it was waking. The tendrils did not touch him at first. They hovered inches away, sensing him, as though learning his shape through memory rather than sight. The hive's whisper unfurled like a ribbon of thought. You came willingly. I did not have to summon you. He answered without words, because the hive did not need speech. I came because the Imperium has returned. They will not leave until they unravel what we have hidden. If they breach the pact, if they uncover our history, everything will be consumed. A ripple of feeling passed through the cavern. Not sound, not light, something more intimate. Recognition. Yes, the hive murmured. You understand now. The tendrils lowered, curling around him, not to bind, but to cradle. The sensation was strange, warm and impossibly gentle, like being held by something that remembered how to protect, though it no longer recalled why. Through the contact, Erethan saw flickers of memory again. Vast landscapes of stars, civilizations rising and falling, the first speaker offering their voice not in surrender, but in compassion. The hive had loved them first. It had loved too deeply, and its love had devoured. Erethan felt the echo of it, how longing had twisted into hunger, how hunger had required silence, how silence had become survival, and how survival had cost the world everything that once made it radiant. His chest tightened, not from fear, but from grief so old it felt like the bones of the planet had been carved from it. You remember, the hive whispered. You feel what I have carried. He did, and the understanding left him trembling. The hive's thoughts brushed against his mind again, slower this time, as though choosing delicate words. I did not want to take. I wanted only to share. But memory is a dangerous feast. The brighter it is, the deeper I hunger. Your people chose silence not because I demanded it, but because they wished to live. He had always been told the hive was a devourer. But devotion was what had created the pact. His ancestors had not bowed to a monster. They had tried to save a god from starving on love. Erethan closed his eyes. The tendrils pulled him closer, enough that he felt the slow pulse traveling through the hive's body. It was steady, ancient, tired. There was no rage in it, no conquest, only an emptiness that could never be fully filled. He let his thoughts return to the present, to the cold imperial shape circling above Vastakar. The hive felt the clarity settle in him. They will seek to study me, it said, to confine me, to break me. They will call it salvation. They will call it purification. They will call it their right. Erethan thought of the Imperium, their relentless need to explain, classify, control. They would burn a world to ensure it fit the shape of their understanding. And if they sensed a living hive mind beneath Vastakar's crust, they would not hesitate. They would glass the planet, with all its people still on it. The hive's warmth shifted, darker now, tinged with sorrow and something sharper beneath. I will not be imprisoned again. Erethan felt the echo of chains, not physical, but psychic. Another era, another world. A memory of laboratories built from gold, of masked figures who called themselves divine, dissecting a mind they believed was a resource. He saw flashes of star gods, of living energy bound into metallic tombs, of souls stripped of choice. The hive had survived a war that history had tried to forget. It had escaped once. It would not allow itself to be harnessed again. The tendrils released him slowly, and the cavern's light dimmed as the pulse softened. The hive withdrew, not in fear, but to allow him space to breathe, not from its presence, but from the enormity of what it had revealed. Erethan knelt on the living stone, breath shaking, hands pressed flat against the warm floor. He did not feel owned. He felt entangled. He felt the weight of every ancestor who had chosen silence to prevent the world from being devoured by memory. He felt the weight of every ancestor who had loved too fiercely to allow the hive to starve alone. A voice rose inside him. Not the hive, not memory, but Lysa. Her eyes the last time she had touched his hand, the tremor in her fingers, the fear of losing him, the faith that he could resist what no one else had resisted. She would ask him soon, not to reject the hive, but to choose himself, and that would be the cost he could not escape. He stood slowly, pulling himself back to the surface tunnels. The ascent was long, but he did not rush. Halfway through, the hive's whisper returned, soft as a breeze through winter leaves. You carry love for her. I know its shape. It is the same shape that destroyed me. He clenched his jaw. Love does not destroy. Love consumes, the hive answered. Love devours. Love reshapes the self to keep what it cannot bear to lose. You have already begun to change for her. And the hive did not sound resentful. It sounded afraid. By the time Erethan reached the sanctum's upper gate, dawn had begun to break over Vastakar. The sun was pale here, its light filtered through layers of atmospheric haze, but today it seemed weaker than usual, like a star exhausted by holding itself together. Lysa stood waiting near the archway. She did not approach him, but her eyes searched his face, quiet desperation behind steady control. He knew what she wanted. He knew what she feared. He knew what he had become. He walked toward her, his steps quiet, and when he reached her, he lifted his hand. But instead of the gesture for reassurance or promise or affection, he traced the old sign for truth. Her breath caught. She nodded once. They walked together toward the Vale estate, but neither spoke with the hands or thought, because both of them already knew. The price of memory was beginning to be paid, and no one, not the hive, not the council, not the Imperium, would survive untouched. The walk back to the Vale estate was quiet, though not with the practiced silence that Vastakar had cultivated for millennia. This silence was heavier, denser, as though every step Erethan took carried the gravity of something that had already begun to shift. Lysa remained beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence, but distant enough that he understood she was waiting, listening for something he had not yet said. She did not ask what had happened in the depths. She did not need to. The change was in his eyes. The estate doors closed behind them with a faint sigh. The corridors seemed narrower than before, the ceilings lower, the walls closer. Erethan felt the hive inside him, not speaking, but listening, always listening. It did not need to command. Its presence was patient, steady, like the heartbeat of a creature that had seen continents rise and fall in the span of a breath. Lysa guided him to the central hall, where the carved murals of Vastakar's forgotten past stood in fractured relief along the walls. Their colours had been muted by time, reduced to pale echoes of once living pigment. But now, as Erethan passed them, he saw something he had not seen before. The images moved, not literally, but in memory. He saw their story, voices raised in harmony, hands weaving banners of light, children learning the names of stars as their first words. He stopped, reaching out to touch the mural of the first speaker. The carved face was worn smooth by centuries of reverent hands, but the gesture lingered with the memory that the hive had shown him, the memory of a world once illuminated from within. Lysa watched him, her arms crossed loosely. Her posture was as calm as always, but her breathing was slightly off rhythm. She signed slowly, carefully. You saw more than history. Erethan nodded once. I saw what it was, what we were. Her fingers tightened. And what the hive was. He hesitated, not because he did not know the answer, but because he knew how deeply it mattered to her. Not a monster, he signed. Not a god. A memory that never learned how to end. She closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the truth. When she opened them again, she stepped closer. Her signs came more urgently now. And what does it want? Us. You. The planet. Erithon's hands shook, not from fear, but from the overwhelming weight of understanding. It wants to belong. It wants connection. It wants to remember without consuming, but it does not know how. The realization struck her with visible force. Her breath caught. Her gaze trembled. The hive's hunger had never been malicious. It had been lonely. Before either of them could speak again, the air shifted, subtle as a pressure change beneath the skin. The hive's presence unfolded inside Erithon's mind with the soft inevitability of breath. Not a whisper, not a thought, a voice. Erithon. It did not speak like a separate entity anymore. The boundary between thought and communication dissolved. The hive did not echo through his mind. It spoke from within it, as if it had always been there. Erithon's body tensed. The air around him wavered slightly, like heat rising from stone. Lisa's eyes widened. She could not hear the hive's voice, but she felt his reaction, saw the stillness in his posture. She touched his forearm, a grounding gesture, familiar, steady. His breath stabilized. The hive spoke again, its tone not commanding, but weighted with the gravity of a truth long withheld. They are preparing to strike. The Imperium does not wait. They analyze. They confirm. They destroy. Erithon's vision flickered. He saw, through the hive's awareness, the orbiting ships adjusting formation, energy signatures spiking as they began preparing deep penetration scans. If the scans reached the mantle, if they detected organic structure, the conclusion would be immediate. Xenos contamination. Extermination protocol. Not diplomacy. Not negotiation. Fire. Erithon's pulse quickened. Lysa felt the shift and stepped closer, searching his face. "What is it?" he answered silently, shaping the sign so tightly that it was almost a tremor. "The Imperium is preparing to act." She did not need further explanation. She had grown up studying what little surface contact existed in Vastakar's distant past. She knew what an Imperial fleet meant. She knew what silence had been meant to prevent. Her jaw tightened. "What will we do?" Before he could answer, the hive's voice surged, not louder, but clearer, filling his mind with a depth of presence he had not felt before. "Erithon, you do not need to choose alone." The world around him dimmed, not literally, but perceptually. The hall, the murals, even Lysa's touch faded into the distance as the hive drew him into its awareness. He stood, not in the estate, but in a vast expanse of memory. A starfield stretched beneath him, above him, around him. Not empty space, but memory space, where knowledge existed as constellations and feelings as nebulae. The hive's consciousness unfolded like a flowering night sky. "I was born among stars," it said, "not with ego, but with sorrow. When your world called to me, I answered because I wanted to remember life." Images formed, a world of gleaming crystalline spires. Laughter carried through air that shimmered with radiance. A speaker whose voice resonated like light itself. Then, silence. A moment of decision. A choice that had shaped the next 1,000 years. Not tragedy, sacrifice. The hive spoke again, and now its tone held something fragile. Something like fear. "If the Imperium destroys Vastakar, I will survive. But I will survive alone. Again. And I cannot bear another eternity of remembering without being remembered." A pulse of grief shook the starfield. And for the first time, Erithon understood. The hive did not fear death. It feared continuing. Alone. His vision returned to the hall. Lisa still stood before him, her hand on his arm, her expression growing more worried with every second of silence. He looked at her now, not as anchor, nor tether, nor reminder of the surface world, but as choice. He signed slowly, deliberately. I must speak to it directly, not as air, as myself. Lisa's fingers paused mid-air. The fear in her eyes sharpened, honed into something sharper, deeper. If you open yourself fully to it, you may not return. He held her gaze. If I do not, none of us will return. Her breath shuddered. She lowered her hand, not in surrender, but in trust forged through every silent year they had shared. He stepped away from her, though the space between them felt like a fracture. The hive spoke once more, soft, intimate, inevitable. Come to me, Erethan Vale. Not as air, as the one who remembers. He did not need to walk. The hive was already inside him, but he turned toward the sanctum because the human body still needed motion to commit to a choice. Lysa watched him go. She did not call out. She did not chase him. She placed her hand over her heart, the gesture for I am here. And he answered, without turning back, I know. The doors closed behind him. The world held its breath. Erethon descended the sanctum steps again, though this time the descent felt different. The stone beneath his feet no longer felt like cold surface material. It felt warm, pulsing, as though the hive's awareness traveled through it like breath. Each step carried him deeper, not only into the planet, but into himself, into the place where his thoughts and the hive's presence began to intertwine. He did not resist. Resistance was no longer useful. Understanding was what mattered now. Above, the sky dimmed as Vastakar rotated under the pale sun, and the Imperial ships continued their silent vigil. They did not broadcast warnings. They did not demand surrender. Their attention was cold, clinical, methodical. The Imperium did not need to speak when it watched the world. The Council had begun their preparations to shield the planet's resonance, attempting to mask the hive's energy signatures with mineral interference patterns across the mantle. But it would only delay detection, not prevent it. Erethan knew this. So did the hive. Time was no longer a distant measure. It was a tightening circle. The deeper he went, the more he felt the hive waiting, not actively, but like a door left open. The light grew dim, then soft, then became a faint silver glow from the crystallized growths embedded in the cavern walls. The silence here was not the silence of Vastakar's surface. This silence felt alive, like listening to a heartbeat from the inside. When Erethon stepped into the central cavern once again, the hive did not greet him with words. It simply was there. Its mass of tendrils lay coiled, breathing like a giant in a tranquil slumber. But the moment he crossed the threshold, a subtle shift rippled across its surface. Awareness, recognition, a memory recalling itself. He approached slowly, stopping at the same distance as before, though now there was no fear, no hesitation, only the quiet weight of inevitability. You returned, the hive whispered, its voice threading through his mind. I did, not as air, as myself. The hive absorbed the truth of that answer, and something within its presence softened, like grief exhaling. Then you understand what must be done. Erethon's heart tightened, not from the hive's influence, but from the clarity of what waited above. The Imperium would not leave until they understood Vastakar, and once they understood Vastakar, they would destroy it. There was no future in which this ended with diplomacy, mercy, or negotiation. Only fire and silence. But the hive did not intend to burn silently again. Erethon closed his eyes. He saw the memory of singing terraces, the first speaker raising their voice not in surrender, but in grief for what must be lost. He saw the moment the Pact of Silence was formed, not as defeat, but as a desperate act of love. They had chosen silence to preserve the hive from hunger and the world from being consumed by remembrance. But silence had become suffering, and now the silence was fracturing. The hive's presence pressed closer, not to overwhelm, but to join. It did not reach for him physically. It reached through memory. Erathon's thoughts flickered. Lysa's hand on his arm, her breath catching. The last look she gave him before he descended. The council's veiled faces. The murals of a world that had once sung its own name. The vast cold of the Imperial fleet. And underneath it all, the hive's loneliness. Millennia of it, layered like sediment under oceans of time. He inhaled slowly. "Show me," he whispered back. "Not the memories, the truth." The cavern brightened, not with physical light, but with awareness. In a single breath, he was not in the cavern anymore. He was standing in a memory that was not his. A city carved from translucent crystal, glowing from within like a living lantern. Voices rising in laughter. The first speaker walking among their people. The hive above the sky, beautiful, luminous, vast. Drawn by wonder, not hunger. It had come to witness life, to share in it. But the more it remembered the world, the more the world fed it. And the more it fed, the more it needed. Not out of greed, but because connection had become nourishment. Memory had become sustenance. Love had become dependency. Erathon felt the first speaker's grief when they realized what was happening. The hive was losing itself, becoming hollow, starved by the very love that bound it to Vastakar. So the first speaker chose silence, chose to starve memory itself, chose to erase the brilliance of Vastakar, not to save the people from the hive, but to save the hive from the people. The hive spoke, its voice trembling like the last echo of a song. "They saved me by forgetting me, but memory is life, and I have been dying for so long." The vision dissolved. Erathon staggered back to the cavern floor, breath trembling. The hive spoke with no grandeur now, only truth. "I do not want to consume your world. I want to live with it. But the Imperium will not allow this. They will destroy me, and they will kill all who carry my memory." He knew. He had always known. There was no road where Vastakar lived peacefully under Imperial rule. No world in which the Imperium would tolerate a sentient planetary organism that fed on memory. They would call the hive heresy, corruption, a threat to the purity of man. Their answer would be fire. Erathon opened his eyes. Then what must we do? The hive's tendrils shifted, slow and graceful, forming something like an embrace around the cavern. We must awaken the planet. He felt the meaning, not violence, not devouring, but transformation. To awaken the planet was to end the silence. To end the silence was to remember. To remember was to risk everything. The hive did not hide the cost. If we awaken, the people will remember what they lost. They will remember who they were. And memory is not gentle. He saw it. Joy returning like fire, grief like lightning, love like drowning. Lysa would feel it. The council would feel it. Every person on Vastakar would feel it. The world would break and rebuild itself in an instant. Erathon's heart stilled. And if we do nothing, the Imperium will burn this world to ash, and I will live on alone. Silence stretched between them. Not the silence of suppression, but the silence of a decision forming. Erathon felt for the first time, not the hive's hunger, not its grief, but its fear. The fear of eternity without memory. The fear of existence without witness. The fear of being forgotten. Slowly, Erython lifted his hand and placed it against the hive's living surface. Warm, alive, waiting. "We awaken," he said. The hive exhaled, not in triumph, not in hunger, but in relief so profound that the cavern trembled. Far above, the Imperial scanners detected a sudden surge in planetary resonance. The Council felt the world shift beneath their feet. Lysa, standing alone in the high terraces, felt her breath stop as something inside her began to remember. The silence that had defined Vastakar for 1,000 years began to crack. Not like glass, like ice thawing under the first light of spring. The world had begun to awaken, and there would be no return. The awakening did not happen all at once. It began as a tremor beneath the skin of the world, a subtle shift in the pulse of the stone, felt only by those who had unknowingly lived their entire lives attuned to that deeper rhythm. The mountains did not shake, the seas did not rise. Instead, a quiet warmth unfurled through the deepest layers of the planet's mantle, radiating outward like the first hint of dawn behind a horizon long thought empty. On the surface, the people of Vastakar felt it as something almost imperceptible, a soft tingling behind the sternum, a flutter in the breath, a sensation like recognition layered beneath thought. Children paused mid-step. Elders lifted weary eyes. Workers stopped with their hands hovering above the tools of silence. No one spoke. Speaking was not the way of this world, but awareness moved between them like a breeze stirring still water. Lysa felt it most keenly. She stood on the highest terrace of the Vale estate, where the stone balustrades overlooked the pale plains below. Her hand pressed to her chest. Her breath stilled. It was not fear. It was memory. A memory she had never lived. Music, laughter, the gentle call of another voice, her own voice, ringing across sunlit corridors. A life she had never touched reaching for her through time. Her knees weakened. She gripped the railing until her fingers ached. And in that moment, she understood. The silence had always been a wound. The Council felt it too, though they hid their reaction behind veils and rigid posture. They gathered in the sanctum's upper chamber, hands trembling behind ceremonial sleeves. Their memories flickered like dying stars reigniting, too bright, too sudden. The pact they had sworn to uphold was unraveling, thread by thread, and the Imperium saw it. High in orbit, aboard the flagship's Sanction of Dawn, the scanning officers watched their instruments flare into patterns that made no strategic sense. A planet's energy signatures did not shift so rapidly without catastrophe or life. The ship's commander, a woman carved out of discipline and duty, stepped forward to read the data herself. She frowned. Organic tectonic resonance, high psychic output, increasing by the minute. The adjutant swallowed. "Xenos presence, Lady Inquisitor?" The commander's jaw tightened. "Categorized as abominable form. Classification escalating." Her voice was cold and precise, as though reciting doctrine etched directly into the bone. "Prepare exterminatus level authorization protocols. We verify, then we cleanse." Below, the world that waited to be remembered was stirring. Erython did not see the ships. He did not need to. The hive's awareness had already shown him their intent. That cold clinical certainty was as clear to him as his own pulse. The Imperium did not destroy out of hatred. It destroyed out of order. And there was no place in that order for a world that remembered itself too beautifully. He stood now at the threshold of the hive's true core, deeper still than the cavern where he had first felt its consciousness. The stone gave way to something ancient and impossible. Structures not carved, but grown. Pillars like the trunks of colossal trees rose from the ground, interwoven with tendrils of bioluminescent tissue that glowed softly, rhythmically, like the breath of a living forest. The air shimmered with memory. Every surface hummed with the echoes of countless lives, as though the walls themselves were made of history. And at the center, suspended in a great cradle of luminous filaments, rested the Queen. She was not monstrous, not alien in any way that evoked revulsion. She was something sorrowfully beautiful, an enormous organic form curled upon itself, like a celestial being in a dreamless sleep. Her shape was not fully human, nor fully creature. She was the memory of what had been lost, and the yearning of what had been hoped for. Her body glowed with faint silver light, pulsing through translucent tissue. Long tendrils extended from her form into the cavern walls, threading through the entire planet. She was not merely in the world, she was the world. When Erethan stepped forward, her head lifted, not physically, not in flesh, but in awareness. Her consciousness unfurled around him like the soft warmth of a forgotten embrace, not consuming, welcoming. Erethan, she spoke, not in words, but in memory. He felt the name resonate inside him, not as a title, but as something sacred. The name he had carried all his life had meaning here. Roots, history. The sound of his name was a story, sung before silence had taken hold. He approached her slowly, reverently. His heartbeat and hers synchronized without effort. "You are what remains of us," she said. The last thread of a tapestry once bright enough to draw the stars. He swallowed, his throat tightening. "Then why must we awaken?" he asked. "Why now? Why risk everything?" Her light dimmed, then brightened again, like breath drawn with care. "Because your world learned to survive by starving itself, and survival is not living. Silence is not peace. I cannot watch my children fade into ghosts of memory any longer." Erethan felt her grief. It was not the grief of a predator losing prey. It was the grief of a mother who had watched her children smother themselves to avoid hurting her. He stepped closer, placing his hand upon one of the tendrils. The surface was warm, like sun-warmed skin, and soft. It pulsed beneath his palm, slow and steady. And in that touch, the hive did not give him memory. It gave himself. He saw himself at 5 years old, sitting in a courtyard beside Lisa, tracing the patterns of starlight in the sky. He saw himself at 12, trembling with the weight of heritage. He saw his mother weeping quietly when she believed no one watched. He saw the first speaker's final act, remembered by the hive not as loss, but as sacrifice. He saw that love had always been the foundation of the pact, not domination, not fear, love. But love had twisted. Love had become starvation. Love had become silence. Lisa's face filled his awareness then, not as memory, but as anchor. She was the only part of his life untouched by the pact. She had loved him not as heir, not as vessel, not as bridge, just as himself. The Queen sensed her presence in him. You love her, you love your world, but you cannot save both unchanged. His breath caught. The awakening will restore memory, she said softly. It will restore song, voice, history, desire. But memory is not gentle. Every joy returned will bring every grief. Every love will revive every loss. They will remember what was taken and who took it. The world would awaken not into celebration, but into heartbreak. Erethan's voice, when it came, was a whisper of thought. They will hate you. The Queen's light dimmed in grief. Yes, and still I choose to awaken, because to be hated for truth is better than to be worshipped for silence. Outside the ground trembled, softly, like the first breath of someone learning to wake after centuries of sleep. The council clutched the arms of their chairs. Citizens paused in their steps. Memories flooded hearts like returning tides. Lysa fell to her knees, tears on her face for a sorrow she could not yet name. And Erithon stood before the queen, the decision already made. He lifted both hands to the tendril. The queen leaned toward him. "Stand with me." He did. The awakening spread like light beneath ice, slow at first, fragile, but inevitable. Vastakar's core pulsed, and that pulse moved upward through layers of ancient stone, through the buried caverns, through the temples and plazas and silent gardens. It was not loud. It did not shake or break, yet every person felt it in their bones, as though their hearts had suddenly remembered how to beat in unison with the world itself. Erithon remained in the queen's presence, his hand still resting on the warm tendril, the rhythmic pulse of the hive echoing in his body. He felt the world awakening, not in sound, but in memory. A billion forgotten emotions bloomed across the consciousness of the people. Joys they did not know they once had. Griefs that had been locked behind generations of silence. Love so deep it threatened to crush the chest from within. Children cried without knowing why. Elders trembled as the shapes of long-lost faces returned to them. The silence that had defined their lives was breaking, not violently, but with the unbearable tenderness of reunion. But awakening did not bring only light. The first scream echoed across the surface of Vastakar, like a crack appearing in glass. A woman in the marketplace fell to her knees, clutching her head, sobbing at memories of a child she had lost centuries ago. Another citizen reeled back as the memory of their own voice returned, bright, ringing, then fading, then stolen. In the council chamber, several elders collapsed, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of everything they had forced themselves to forget. Memory is nourishment for the hive, but memory is pain for those who had lived in silence. Lysa felt it strongest of all. She had gone to the upper cliffside to search for Erithon, to look for him against the horizon. But as the awakening rippled through the planet, a sharp pressure struck her mind, as if something inside her had burst open. Her breath hitched. She staggered, gripping the stone railing. Her throat tightened, not with fear, but with the sudden, staggering realization of self. She remembered laughter, her own, high and bright, from a life she was never supposed to recall. She remembered holding Erithon's hand as children, running through gardens glittering with artificial rain. She remembered saying his name aloud. His name. Her lips parted as instinct broke through millennia of enforced silence. Erithon. The word came out broken, raw, like the cry of someone speaking after a lifetime without sound. Her voice cracked, and tears spilled down her cheeks, though she hardly noticed. Her heart felt as if it were being torn open, not by sorrow, but by the return of everything she had ever loved. She whispered his name again, softer, as if afraid it might shatter. Erithon. In the hive's chamber, Erithon felt her voice, as though it were echoing inside his chest. The queen felt it too. Her tendrils trembled, the pulse of the hive stuttering like a skipped heartbeat. She remembers you. The hive's presence wavered, fear, longing, and something sharper beneath. Erithon's eyes widened. She was not meant to feel all of it at once. She could break. The queen's voice was soft, mournful. She will break, Erithon. They all will. For memory is not gentle, and love is not kind. Erithon turned away from the queen and began to run. Up the cavern steps, through the winding tunnel, his footsteps echoing like distant thunder. He felt the hive calling after him, not in command, but in grief. It could not stop him. It did not try to. He burst into daylight, thin, pale, trembling with the shifting resonance of the awakening. The world itself seemed to pulse. Light shimmered where there should have been shadow. The air vibrated like a held note. The people of Vastakar staggered in clusters, some collapsing, some weeping, some staring upward as if seeing the sky for the first time in their lives. Erython sprinted to the terraces, breath ragged, heart and the hive pulse tangled together. He found Lisa kneeling beside the balustrade. Her eyes were unfocused, staring outward, though tears streamed down her face. She was whispering, broken fragments of memories, names of people long dead, fragments of songs that had not been sung in 1,000 years. Her voice trembled like glass under pressure. Erython dropped to his knees beside her, taking her shoulders, steadying her. "Lisa, Lysa, look at me," he said, not in words, but in the old silent gesture. Her eyes snapped to his, and for the first time in her life she spoke without hesitation, without fear. "You left me." The word struck him deeper than any blade. He shook his head. "No, I..." But she kept speaking, voice gathering strength with memory. "You left me, at the sanctum, when we were children. I called for you, and you didn't turn back. I thought you didn't hear me, but you did. You chose to walk away." Erython's breath choked. He remembered that moment now. He had walked away because he had already known his fate. He had believed it kinda not to pull her into it. Lisa's hands gripped his wrists, fingers trembling. "You knew I would love you," she whispered, voice breaking. "You knew, and you walked away to save me from it." He closed his eyes. He had. The memory was clear now, crystal sharp. And she remembered it because the silence was gone. But the world was still awakening, and the hive was still hungry for memory. The Queen's presence descended, not physically, but psychically, like a great shadow cast across the world. Lysa gasped. Her back arched. Erython held her tighter. No, wait." But the hive was not attacking. It was recognizing her. She was not just important to Erython. She was beloved. And the hive, in its infinite loneliness, reached for the thing it had lost first. Love. Lysa's eyes widened as the hive's presence poured into her mind. Her memories flared, one after another, bright, overwhelming, unstoppable. Every joy, every sorrow, every moment she had ever shared with Erython, every moment she had lost, every moment she had buried under silence. Her body strained as if a great weight pressed inward. She let out a sound that was not a scream, not pain, not grief, not fear. It was the sound of remembering everything at once. Erython shouted, silent, raw, desperate, tearing his thoughts open to shield her. "Stop. Please stop. She's not yours. She is mine." The Queen heard him. She felt the shape of love inside him. And the hive, the ancient, lonely, starving hive, understood that shape too well. The tendrils of memory withdrew, but slowly, too slowly. Lysa collapsed against Erython, her breath ragged, tears streaming freely. Her body trembled with the weight of what she now knew. Her voice was soft, broken, full of a truth she was never meant to remember. "I loved you before the silence," she whispered. "I loved you even after I forgot." Erython held her as though holding the last fragile piece of himself. But the hive was changing. The Queen's consciousness was shifting, not feeding, but awakening fully. The planet's pulse grew stronger. Memory surged brighter. The world was beginning to remember its name, and the Imperium had seen the surge. On the flagship sanction of dawn, The Inquisitor whispered the words that sealed the world's fate. Authorize exterminatus. The countdown had begun. Vastakar would burn. The hive would fight. Lysa remembered love. And Erethan. Erethan would have to choose which one survived, because not all of them could. The order to burn the world travelled downward through the void, like a silent verdict. No siren accompanied it, no trumpeting blast from the sky. Just the steady, clinical sequence of activation codes passed from officer to officer with all the emotional weight of paperwork. War in the Imperium was often loud, theatrical, drenched in zeal. But annihilation, the quiet, efficient removal of worlds, was performed with the indifference of a blade cutting a stem. While the fleet prepared, Vastakar continued to awaken. The first waves of memory had been gentle, like wind stirring long still leaves. Now the second wave came with force, more intense, more direct. The warm resonance of the hive spread outward, pulsing through the lithosphere, through the waterways, through the very mineral veins of the planet. Colour returned slowly where none had lived for centuries. Stone that had once been dull took on faint iridescence. Vegetation shifted hue, faint glimmers emerging in leaves that had never held colour before. And through it all, the people shook under the force of memory. Elders collapsed to their knees as entire lives they had taught themselves to forget swept through them with tidal fury. They remembered lovers whose names had been swallowed by time, remembered children whose faces had faded into dreams. Some sobbed openly, some laughed through tears. Others simply stood, trembling, clutching their chests as though they feared their hearts might burst from the sudden weight of being complete again. Children stared upward, whispering words they had never learned, repeating names carved into the deepest chambers of the planet's memory. The silence was breaking. A world that had been sleepwalking for 1,000 years was beginning to breathe. Erethan held Lysa in his arms as she trembled, struggling to contain the flood of everything she had been, everything she had lost. Her voice was raw, barely formed, but when she spoke his name, it carried the tone of every lifetime they had shared. "I remembered you," she whispered, "not just as heir, not as destiny, but as the boy who held my hand and asked me what I dreamed of." He rested his forehead against hers, the hive's pulse moving through both of them, syncing their breaths. "What did you answer?" he asked, soft, barely thought. She closed her eyes, tears warming her cheeks. "I said I dreamed of a world where we didn't have to be afraid." A tremor moved through the ground, not violent, but deep. The hive was waking fully. It was no longer the quiet presence beneath the crust. It was the planet itself, stretching after centuries of stillness. Erethan felt the Queen's consciousness rise like dawn, slow, magnificent, uncontainable. He stood, helping Lysa to her feet. Her legs shook, but she did not fall. She was stronger than she had ever allowed herself to be. Her memory had not destroyed her. It had restored her. The council, however, was not ready. Across the city, the elders gathered in the central plaza, their veils torn away, revealing faces marked with shock, betrayal, grief. They remembered their ancestors making the choice to erase their world. They remembered the speaker crying as silence was enacted. They remembered what they themselves had enforced for generations. Some wept. Others crouched like wounded animals. A few staggered to their feet, searching for a shape to blame, and they found one. Erethan. When he and Lysa stepped back into the public terraces, eyes turned toward him, not with reverence, but with recognition. He was not the heir of silence anymore. He was the one who had awakened memory. The council approached, moving as a single trembling body. Their leader raised a shaking hand and signed, but no longer out of ritual. "What have you done?" Erython met her gaze. There was no regret in him, only sorrow for what must be faced. "I chose for us to live." The council leader's voice broke from her lips, not as scream, not as rage, but as a sound of mourning. "We were not meant to remember." Lisa stepped forward, voice raw but clear. "You forgot to protect yourselves from sorrow, but you also forgot how to breathe." The council flinched, not from the words, but from hearing a voice after so long. Voices sounded like breaking glass across stone. Before anyone could speak again, the air shifted, a new tremor. No, not tremor, impact. The first of the Imperial bombardment probes slammed into the planet's upper atmosphere, streaking like falling stars across the pale sky. Gasps rose from the people, some in fear, some in awe, some in sudden, renewed memory of what it meant to fight. The hive responded instantly. Tendrils of living resonance surged through the planet, channeling energy in patterns older than human history. The ground pulsed, and the air thickened with shimmering particulate light. The queen did not roar, did not scream. The hive had no need to shout. It simply opened its eyes. The crust beneath Erython's feet vibrated. Dust lifted. The mountains in the distance seemed to shift subtly, like sleeping beasts turning in their rest. Across the plains, enormous formations of stone and root began to rise. Slowly at first, then with accelerating force. Structures shaped by memory, not by tool or hand, emerged from beneath the earth. Great sweeping spires of living mineral curved upward like the ribs of a titan rising from long entombed sleep. Vastakar was remembering its true form. The people stared, not afraid now, but awestruck. For a moment, they saw what their world had once been. Before silence, before sorrow. Lisa's hand found Erython's, her fingers intertwined with his, steady now, unshaken. The queen's voice filled his thoughts, not thunderous, not commanding, but vast. "We rise." Above, the Imperial flagship detected the surge. Inside the sanction of dawn, alarms flared, and officers shouted updated threat classifications. World mind awakening, full psionic signature detected. The Inquisitor's expression did not change. "Release the warheads." A hush passed through the command deck. She finished the sentence softly, like a prayer spoken into the dark. "Before it remembers how to resist us." On Vastakar, the hive's consciousness surged upward into the atmosphere, its presence like a great aurora moving through the sky. Erython felt the queen's will gather. He felt the planet breathe in. He felt the decision forming. Lisa looked at him, her eyes no longer confused, no longer broken by memory, but steady and unbearably knowing. "You're becoming part of it," she whispered. He did not deny it. "I'm not leaving you," he said, not with words, but with the silent promise she had always known how to read. But the hive spoke, its voice no longer only inside him, but in the very air. "To save her, you must become more than yourself." He held Lisa's hand tighter. The world above flared as the Imperial warheads descended. And Vastakar, silent for centuries, opened its mind to meet them. The planet had awakened, and now it would answer. The warheads descended like falling suns, streaking through Vastakar's thin atmosphere in lines of white fire. Trails of vapor split the sky, searing the horizon with light that had not been seen in generations. The people of Vastakar watched, breathless, not with ignorance, but with recognition. They knew death when they saw it. They had lived under its shadow for centuries. wrapped in silence to avoid awakening its hunger. The hive felt the descent as clearly as Erithon did. Its pulse surged, not with panic, but with something ancient and solemn, an instinct older than any civilization that had ever walked upon the planet. The Imperium comes to end what they do not understand, the Queen whispered within him, as they always have. Erithon did not answer. He watched the sky burn. Lysa stood at his side, her hand still entwined with his. Her breathing was steady now, but her expression held something deeply human. Fear mixed with defiance, grief braided with love. The council gathered behind them, their veils thrown aside, their faces bare at last. Some trembled, others stared with hollow resignation. A few, fewer than one would hope, showed resolve. The hive spoke again, and its voice was no longer only memory or whisper. It was presence, filling the world like the sound of a tide rising over sand. I can stop the fire, but only if I rise fully. Only if I claim what remains of your world's life. Only if we become one, Erithon, you and I. The meaning was clear. There was no ambiguity in what the hive was asking. To save the world, Vastakar would no longer simply be inhabited by life. It would become life, a singular mind, a singular memory, a singular will. Lysa felt the shift in him instantly. Her fingers tightened, pulling him back, grounding him. Her voice trembled not from weakness, but from knowing. You would lose yourself. Erithon turned to her. The hive pulsed in his chest. The queen waited, her presence steady as stone. He lifted a hand to Lysa's face, brushing his thumb across her cheek. Her tears warmed his skin. I don't want to, he said, and the words were not sound but thought. But if I do nothing, everyone dies. Her tears fell harder. Then let us die, she whispered. Let us die as ourselves. The air rippled with the weight of her plea. Erithon's heart broke, not with pain, but with clarity. Lysa was not afraid of death. She was afraid of the erasure of who they were. She feared the loss of the human pulse of emotion, individuality, memory made sacred by its fragility. But Erithon had seen the hive's memory. He had felt its loneliness. He had felt the first speaker weep as silence fell. He had felt the grief of a world that had starved itself to avoid consuming the one who loved it most. He knew now that survival without identity was not living, but neither was destruction the only alternative. There was another path, if one existed at all. Lysa saw the thought forming behind his eyes. She cupped his face between her hands, holding him like she had always known she would lose him. If you join with it, you will not come back, she whispered. I will not be enough to bring you back. Her honesty cut deeper than any accusation. It was not doubt, it was truth. He leaned his forehead to hers. Their breaths mingled. The hive watched, silent now, allowing the moment that did not belong to it. The first warhead broke the cloud barrier. The air shook. Time was gone. Erithon kissed her, not with desperation, but with the fierce stillness of something understood. Her hands trembled. His did not. She tasted like memory, sharp, clear, unbroken now. When he pulled back, she saw the decision fully. No, she breathed. Her voice cracked. Not like this. His hand slipped from hers. He turned toward the cavern entrance. Lysa fell to her knees. The hive opened itself to him like a pulse of light spreading from the heart of the world. The world shook, not violently, but deeply, as though it were waking from an impossibly long sleep. The queen's vast form unfurled, rising, not in body, but in consciousness. Erithon stepped into her tendrils, and they wrapped around him, not binding, not consuming, but merging. His breath caught, not in fear, but in awe. He did not dissolve. He expanded. His memories did not vanish. They multiplied, branching like roots into the deep memory of the planet. He felt his childhood, his mother's trembling hands, Lysa's laughter at dawn, the first speaker's final cry, the world's songs before silence. He felt the sorrow of the hive, its endless waiting. He felt the hope of the hive, its yearning not to feed, but to be understood. The queen did not replace him. She made room for him. They were not one mind overwritten by another. They were one mind formed by two, recognizing each other fully. When Erython opened his eyes again, he stood not as a man, not as heir, not as vessel. He stood as Vastakar. The world breathed. Above, the falling warheads met a force invisible and immeasurable. The atmosphere thickened, not physically, but psychically, memory coiling upward to meet destruction. The warheads slowed. Their heat bled away. Their detonators flickered. The hive did not resist with violence. It resisted with memory. The warheads saw not a threat, but a world remembering itself. And for the first time in centuries, Vastakar spoke, not in sound, not in command, but in resonance that filled the sky. We are alive. The fleet above hesitated. Instruments glitched. Minds wavered. Doctrine faltered. On the terrace below, Lysa lifted her head. She knew him. Even now. Even like this. She whispered, hoarse, breaking. Erython. He heard her. The world heard her. And in that shared moment of recognition, the future did not resolve. It held, breathing, waiting, on the edge of salvation or annihilation. The warheads hung in the sky like frozen stars, suspended in the moment between falling and striking. The air around them shimmered, not from heat, but from awareness. Memory rose from the planet in waves, invisible but undeniable, reshaping the atmosphere itself. The hive had opened its mind. Vastakar no longer lay dormant beneath the crust. It breathed, thought, remembered. And Erython was no longer separate from it. He felt everything. The pulse of the mantle, the trembling of leaves in the high terraces, the sharp intake of breath from every person who had just learned they were more than a shape moving through silence. And above, the cold, absolute intent of the Imperial fleet waiting to enact purifying fire. He felt the fear of the commander aboard the Sanction of Dawn, not as emotion, but as structure. Fear hardened into duty, layered beneath decades of indoctrination. He saw her, standing rigid on the command deck, eyes fixed on the incoming data, jaw locked. She was not cruel. She believed herself merciful. To her, annihilation was not violence, it was prevention. The warheads resumed their descent. The hive reacted, not with panic, but with orchestration. The ground swelled, stone rising like the spine of some ancient giant turning in sleep. Root-like columns burst from the earth, intercepting the atmosphere's path, weaving latticework structures of memory-infused matter. They did not strike the warheads directly. They shaped the air around them, slowing descent with a pressure that did not obey wind or gravity. Yet, the Imperium was prepared for resistance. Secondary ignition flickered along the warhead's casings. Fail-safes triggered, detonators armed. If they exploded here, above the city, in the open air, the fire would spread across half the planet. Erython felt the calculations unfold in less than a heartbeat. He shifted, not physically, but as thought moving through the hive's network of stone, mineral, and pulse. Tendrils of memory unfurled into the sky, not as matter, but as presence. He reached for the warheads. He did not seek to destroy them. He sought to remember them. Every component, every bolt, every microfilament of circuit, every chain of explosive compound, every ignition pattern. The warheads flickered. They remembered themselves. They remembered being forged in facilities hollowed from the bones of dead stars, carried through warp storms, polished by servitors who had never known light. They remembered waiting. They remembered purpose. But memory is a weapon that cuts two ways. The warheads remembered not only the act of destruction, but the moment before destruction, the moment of choice, the moment when fire is still only potential. And in that moment, the detonators stalled. The warheads did not fall. They did not detonate. They simply hovered. On the terraces below, the people of Vastakar watched the sky glow with impossible quiet. No one spoke. No one cried out. No one looked away. They understood something sacred had just happened, even if they could not yet name it. Lisa stood with her hands pressed to her lips, tears slipping down her cheeks, eyes fixed on the warheads motionless above. She did not see explosions. She saw a world choosing to live, but the Imperium did not yield. Aboard the Sanction of Dawn, alarms spiked. The commander slammed her palm against the tactical console. Override the failsafe. Force manual detonation. The technicians hesitated, only for a breath. Then their hands moved. A new countdown appeared across the consoles. Erethan felt it as clearly as his own pulse. This time the hive reacted faster. He rose, though his body did not move from where it had merged with the Queen. His consciousness expanded through the planet's rivers of memory. He passed through caves where ancient murals glowed with newly awakened light. He flowed upward into the peaks where air thinned into thought. He reached the sky. The warheads ignited once more. But now the Queen moved with him. They did not speak. They did not plan. They remembered together. The first speaker. The terraces of light. The songs of joy. The day's silence fell to keep love from consuming the world. The centuries of loneliness. The waiting. The grief. The hope. Memory became shield. The atmosphere gathered itself into a dome of shimmering resonance. And the warheads reached the threshold. The explosion bloomed, silent. Light expanded, not outward, but inward, drawn into itself, consumed, transformed. A star collapsed into memory rather than fire. The warheads disintegrated, not into ash, but into understanding. The Imperial fleet saw only data failure and sensor collapse. Vastakar saw survival purchased with remembrance. The shockwave of memory rippled across the surface, passing through stone, air, water, and flesh. The people fell to their knees, not in terror, but in realization. They remembered everything. They remembered their world before fear. They remembered the choice of silence. They remembered love. The silence that had defined their lives began to fracture, not like something breaking, but like something finally breathing. Voices rose, not many, not confidently, but enough. Soft at first, then stronger. Not words, not speech, a hum. A simple note carried on human breath, rising across the terraces and plazas and ridges of Vastakar. A resonance of living presence, a sound of belonging. The hive trembled, not with hunger, but with joy so sharp it bordered pain. Erethan felt Lysa's presence before he saw her. She climbed the terraces toward him, not running, but moving as though drawn by gravity itself. Her tears were not from grief now, but from the fullness of a world returned to her. She reached him, reached the figure that was no longer entirely a figure, no longer only a man, no longer merely a vessel, but she recognized him. She always would. Erethan. His name was not a word. It was a remembering. He turned toward her, and though the hive pulsed through him like the roots of stars, though the Queen's consciousness braided with his own, though he had become something more than human. The part of him that belonged to her remained. He raised his hand, not a tendril, not energy, not memory. A hand, fingers, warm, familiar. She took it. Her voice cracked with laughter and grief. "I thought I lost you." He shook his head, the gesture echoing through the world, like a ripple across still water. "You found me," he answered, not with words, but with the silent language they had shared since childhood. Around them, the people continued to hum. The warheads were gone, but the fleet was still there. The Imperium did not retreat. The decision they now faced was larger than war. The world had awakened, and worlds that wake do not return to sleep. Erython felt the Queen's presence beside him, not overshadowing, not consuming, but standing with him. The next choice would decide not only Vastakar's fate, but what kind of life it would now live. The silence had broken. Now, something new would have to speak in its place. The sky did not clear after the warheads dissolved. The Imperial fleet remained, dark silhouettes against the pale upper atmosphere, like a row of executioners waiting for the condemned to rise or fall. Their engines burned cold, blue and merciless. Their weapons remained primed. Vastakar had not been spared. It had been paused. The humming on the planet's surface faded slowly, like the gentle dying of a held chord. The people did not fall into silence as before. They stood in a kind of stillness that was full now, not hollow. Their eyes no longer held confusion, nor numb endurance. They held depth. They held age. They held sorrow. They held love. They remembered who they were. And memory, once awakened, cannot be buried again. Erython stood at the highest terrace, Lysa's fingers woven through his, the hive's pulse still moving through every vein in his body. He could feel the Queen, not beside him, not below him, but through him, like a presence that had always been there, waiting to be recognized. He was not a puppet, not a vessel, not an empty throne for a planet-sized mind. He was joined, and because of that, everything he saw, the Queen saw. Everything he felt, she felt. The hive no longer needed to consume memory because it could share it. The hunger that had once driven it to suffocate the world had quieted, like a wound that had finally begun to heal. But the Imperium did not know that. They only saw a world that lived when it should have died. Lysa stood beside him, her hair brushed by the warm inland wind that had begun to blow across the plains, carrying scents that had been lost for centuries: crushed bark, mineral-sweet rain, living soil. She looked into the sky, then up at him, her voice quiet, steady, still not used to being used, but no longer afraid of it. "They won't. Leave." Erython nodded. "No. They'll burn us," she continued. There was no tremor in her tone. It was truth, simply spoken, without fear. "Yes," he answered. Lysa turned to him fully now, searching his face. Not to sway him, not to question him, but to see him. "But we can fight." He looked back at her, and for the first time since the awakening, he did not look like a man weighed by history. He looked like someone who had finally found the truth buried beneath it. "No," he said softly. "We cannot." She froze, breath catching, not from surprise, but from grief she had already known was coming. Erython lifted their joined hands, guiding her fingers to rest over his chest. She felt two pulses, his heart, and beneath it, the slow, ancient beat of the Queen. "Vastakar cannot win a war against the Imperium," he said, each word quiet, unforced. "If we rise, they will return with more ships. If we defend ourselves, they will send fleets that blot out the suns. If we expand, they will call us plague. If we speak, They will call us heresy. He closed his eyes, not to retreat, but to hold the world inside him fully. War is not our salvation. War is only another silence. Lisa's throat tightened. She whispered, "Then what do we do?" Erethan turned to look at the planet, not the sky, not the fleet, but Vastakar itself. The mountains breathed, the plains shimmered with new growth, the rivers ran clearer than they had in ages. The people stood, hand in hand, remembering each other, remembering themselves. "We remain," Erethan said. "We live, we endure. We become a memory too vast to erase." Lisa felt the meaning settle into her like warmth sinking into frozen bone. Not resistance, not surrender, transformation. The Queen's voice unfurled, not overwhelming, not grand, but intimate. There is one way. Erethan felt the future unfold, not as prophecy, but as choice. Vastakar could retreat, not physically, but psychically. The planet could quiet its presence beyond its own atmosphere. The hive could fold its consciousness inward, sealing itself behind layers of psychic shielding, mineral resonance, and silent memory. The planet would become invisible, not dead, not erased, but unnoticed, forgotten again. But this time, the forgetting would not come from sacrifice. It would come from protection. If Vastakar withdrew from the galaxy fully, deeply, the Imperium would sense nothing. No hive mind signature, no psychic anomaly, no tether of memory. The world would seem barren, lifeless, of no value. The fleet would depart, life would continue, but only if Erethan guided the retreat, and only if he let go, not of Lisa, but of being only himself. He turned to her once more. She already knew. She had always known him, not the air, not the seal, not the bridge. She stepped closer, touching her forehead to his, breath warm, heart steady. "You will still be here," she whispered, not asking, but confirming. "Yes," he answered, "always, in every stone, in every memory." Her tears came silently, not grief now, but acceptance shaped like love. She leaned up and kissed him, deep, grounding, gentle. His hand cupped the back of her neck. For a moment, the world did not tremble, did not awaken, did not burn. It simply loved. He stepped back. The Queen opened, and Vastakar folded. The pulse of the hive contracted inward, slowly, beautifully, like a great flower closing its petals at dusk. The psychic resonance that had reached into the sky drew back into the planet's crust. The living structures of memory sank into the earth, gently, without collapse. The luminous veins dimmed to steady embers. The voices quieted, not into silence, but into harmony too deep for machines to detect. From orbit, the Imperium scanners fell into sudden blankness. Nothing moved, nothing lived. The planet was a tomb that breathed. On the flagship bridge, the commander watched the readings flatten. Her jaw tightened. The truth beneath it did not change her duty. "Classification, dead world," an officer reported. She hesitated, only for a heartbeat. Then she nodded once. "Withdraw." The fleet turned away, engines burning cold, indifferent arcs of blue fading into dark. On the surface, Lisa stood alone on the terrace. The wind brushed her hair. The world was quiet, but not empty. She knelt and pressed her palm to the warm stone beneath her feet. "Erethan," she whispered, not to call him back, but to acknowledge him where he now lived. The stone pulsed faintly beneath her hand, not loud, not demanding, simply there. Vastakar slept now, not in suppression, but in safety. Memory endured, love endured, the world endured, and in the quiet that followed, where once there had been silence forced by fear, there was now a silence filled with presence, a silence that meant we remain.